Good morning, Shanthini.
Morning, Frank. Good to
Thank,
talk to you today.
yeah, thanks a bunch for making some time to talk to me about this amazing book that you've written and that is out now called Woman in Solitary Inside the Female Resistance to Apartheid. Um, I wanted to talk to you about this book because, everybody, sort of everybody knows about the Rivonia trial of 1963, 1964, which eventually led to the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. But not a lot of people know about the trial of the 22, which took place in 1969 and which your book starts with. In a way, you argue that this trial is as crucial and as important as the Rivonia trial. Can you explain to me why?
So, Frank, the Rivonia trial and the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela and many others, the leaders of the ANC, African National Congress movement, which was fighting for democracy in South Africa, is well known because it drew a lot of international attention. People knew what was going on in South Africa, and everyone was well aware. And then the ANC itself and the country went into a state of almost you could call it a form of mourning because the leaders and the heart of the movement were in prison. However, there were also a number of people in exile, but the movement continued during the 1960s and onward. And what happened in between that very long period of the leadership being in imprisonment and in prison, and then democracy in 1994 involved a lot of people and involved many trials. This particular trial of 1969 involved Winnie Mandela, who was obviously Nelson Mandela's wife, and a number of women. There were 7 women with her, and it was called the trial of 22. So the rest were obviously men. But why it was important was that these were the people who were left behind to continue with the movement and to keep it going. And Winnie Mandela at the time obviously was, the figurehead for the movement in the country. And the other important relevance of this trial and of the women who were involved in it is that it collapsed. It didn't result in longer term imprisonment as the Rivonia trial did.
And so you're in your book, you telling the story of 4 women. How did you pick these stories? How did you sort of come about their stories, and how did you choose to focus on these 4 women?
So this was the thing. When Winnie Mandela died, I was a reporter for the Sunday Times in South Africa, and I was tasked with going back to her cell and her time in prison, which was obviously revisited in memoriam. But what was interesting was these women, unlike also the Rivonia trialists, they were kept in solitary confinement and obviously separated male and female. And what I found was that the trial was absolutely fascinating because because the women refused to testify against each other. That the trial collapsed, and in 1970 they were allowed to be released and to continue with the movement. But the time in prison was really significant because solitary confinement was a form of mental and physical torture that was used by the apartheid government to try and break these women down and their comrades as well. But the women had a very different prison experience, and part of the reporting on Winnie Mandela's death was that how she had. People said she'd become militant and she had committed fraud and all sorts of things, not realizing what her lived experience was, being in solitary confinement in all that time, whether they were post-traumatic effects, which led to whatever she did afterwards, in her life. And also she was banished, to a barren little town in rural South Africa for 5 years. She was cut off. Her contact was really cut off. So for me, it was a look into what were the emotional and mental aspects of this type of imprisonment on the woman, because it was unique. It wasn't as other political imprisonments and detentions were. As I said, solitary confinement plus torture, which they were subjected to, and what was the result of it. And I was very interested to find that 4 of the women were still alive, and those are the 4 that I've written about now. Because I was able to get the story from them, which wasn't really well told before.
And in a way, that's why it's important to remember, right? I mean, your book shows that freedom has a price, as you just explained, right? Even psychologically, going through years of solitary confinement is not something easy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, this is something that I think is very important for us as South Africans and in the world to realize just how much it takes for people to be activists, for people to be a part of this movement, and also to, it's a triumphant story about women. It's about how they overcame that difficult time, and how that's really, I just found it really inspiring, and a really brave part of our history, which I wasn't aware of even as a journalist, and which I've now come to hear from many South Africans, that people were just not aware of it.
So your book is a story of struggle, resistance, but also survival. And as we've just explained, this has an immense impact on the rest of these women's life. If today's youth or various social movements or resistance movement could take maybe 1 or 2 advice from these women's stories, or could maybe remember 1 or 2 things out of the book, what would you like it to be?
Sure, it's how they really spent, their time dedicated to their cause was done without any visibility. For one, we live in a very visible world, through social media, which is very important in terms of activism. But at the same time, it's something of, it gives a person who is an activist some sort of incentive, in a way, that they carried their struggle out in a very humble and very unwavering strength of character, and this is something that I think is of value in a very fast-paced, conspicuous consumption kind of world that we live in now. And I think, this pandemic has given us a bit of time to think about reflecting and patience. And if we had to, I even compare the lockdowns that we went through around the world to their time in prison, and it was still nowhere close to what they went through. And from that is to learn that we do have resilience in us, that we do have, strength that we may not know how to leverage. And although I can't pinpoint what it was that made them strong and made them that dedicated, even up to today, because our democracy is not perfect, our world is not perfect, their struggle continues, as they say. I think it is to find, for us today, whether we are activists or ordinary citizens, to find where our strength and resilience comes from, and that we do have a lot more strength and resilience than we may think we do.
Another thing your book addresses is that the story, or the historical story, of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa is a very male-orientated one, right? I mean, the heroes of the anti-apartheid struggle that people remember are mostly male. But would you like your book, or do you think your book could try to change this narrative and to show that women, as usual, because in many struggles, in pretty much all struggles around the world, women have got a huge part to play, and actually are sometimes the one on the front lines. Would you like your book to change this narrative, at least in South Africa, to start with?
Definitely to start in South Africa, and also around the world. There is I call it her story, because history has always looked at the male gaze. It's in even in popular culture. We saw Netflix recently doing that lovely campaign around a new show where they placed a statue of a female or the sister or cousin of an important figure in history next to the male statues all over London. And I think that is definitely a case of in South Africa, we've always held our male leaders in high esteem, but what we have to think about what happened when they were in prison or when they were not, even when they were not in prison. You know, they were definitely, there were women's movements throughout the struggle, but we know maybe a handful of names. We don't know the details of what their lives entailed, because there is an added, you know, even as today as women, we've got an added responsibility in our careers, in our child rearing and everything. It's something that exists all over the world, even today. And that despite that, there were female stories. And we just don't know enough of them. We don't know enough of the of where the women found their strength in a time that was not even you know, as gender focused as we are now. So I think it's absolutely important to know where we come from, and in that we can move forward in a position of strength.
Finally, and that would be my last question, how was your book received in South Africa? How has it been received so far?
You know, it's been really beautifully received. If I had one intention with the book, was to highlight the particular women in the apartheid struggle who I felt were really, really, you know, central to our democracy. I think that has definitely happened. Their names are more well known and their names are being spoken. So that's wonderful. And at the same time, it has, exactly as you asked, is to realize that there are missing stories, there are missing narratives around the world, in South Africa definitely, and that it has, I hope, stirred people's interest, you know, to try and go and find these women and find their stories, particularly while they are still alive and still with us.
Thanks, Shanthini. Thanks a lot.
It's a pleasure, Frank. Thank you for having me.